All right. We're going to take a look in this video at chapter 1 of utilitarianism. After that, I'm going to not quite stick to the chapters. The order in which Mill did things in this book is a little bit confusing. So I'll do chapter 1, and then I'll get into issues that do get covered in chapter 2, but they get covered also in the last chapter. So there'll be some bouncing around after that. But for now, let's take a look at chapter 1. General remarks. Great title for a chapter. It tells you nothing about what's going on. What's going on in chapter 1 is Mill is looking at moral epistemology. Now, you have here the screen from the previous video that shows the great utilitarians. And the reason I put moral epistemology over with John Stuart Mill and Henry Sidgwick is that a concern with moral epistemology was the overriding concern for Henry Sidgwick. And he sort of started off on that path by John Stuart Mill. So what's moral epistemology? Well, you hopefully have some idea of what morality is. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. It comes from the Greek word episteme, which translated into Latin was scientia and into English was science, but really means something like an organized theoretical body of knowledge. And logi, the end of it, logi, comes from the Greek word logos, which in this context means study of. So epistemology is the study of organized theoretical knowledge. Okay. So the question is, how can we know that moral theories are true? That's what moral epistemology asks. And Mill distinguishes between two ways you could go about having a theory be justified. One way is to start with general principles and then derive particular knowledge from general principles. So on this model of moral epistemology, you would start out with principles that cover everything, moral rules that apply in all cases. Exactly the kind of thing Kant was going for, exactly the kind of thing Aristotle thought we couldn't have. But on this model, you figure out what the general principles are first, and then if you want to know whether some particular action is right or wrong, you consult the general principles and you apply them to whatever situation you're in, or whatever situation you're asking about, to see what the particular truth is in this case. That's one model for moral epistemology. A different model is to start with particular knowledge. And I'll do it this way. Start with particular knowledge. And from particular knowledge, go to general principles. This is, Mill points out, the method of science. So in science, we start out with particular observations, and we derive our general principles, the laws of nature, the big theories, things like that. We derive them from our observations. So if you're trying to figure out how, well, Darwin's a good example. Darwin, in presenting his case for the theory of evolution and on the origin of the species, starts from a bunch of particular observations of things that like honeybees do, things that like dogs do, things that plants in his backyard do. Occasionally talking about the famous Galapagos Island stuff, but actually not all that much. In the origin of species anyway. And from that, he derives the general principles about population, about competition, scarcity, variation over time, all that stuff, he derives from particular observations. So as Mill points out, in the science, you start with the particular and you get to the general principles last. The general principles are sort of the big accomplishment of science, figuring out what's going on to explain all the particular things you observe. That's what scientists get to at the end. Like when Newton had his big theory of gravity, he started out with observations of where the planets were in the night sky. He started out with the observations of experiments of the kind that Galileo ran, of rolling balls down inclines, and only at the end got to the laws of motion. Mill thinks the scientific approach, where you start with particular knowledge and you go to general principles, can't work for morality. And the reason is we don't have a way of getting particular knowledge about morality. He talks about the moral sense school of thought. Moral sense school of thought was a school of thought in ethics very popular in Great Britain in the 1600s and 1700s. I didn't assign you any stuff from them. I mean, I didn't assign you anything from Aristotle to Kant, so there's like a 2,000-year gap. But I didn't assign you any of the moral sense theorists because well, for reasons Mill kind of gives, right? One, it's on its face implausible. So the idea the moral sense theorists had was you have a moral sense just like you have a sense of hearing, a sense of smell, a visual sense, right? You can, when observing a particular situation, detect directly the rightness, the wrongness, the goodness, or the badness in that situation. So if you watch somebody getting beaten up, you have, in addition to your physical senses, which tell you, all right, there's a person getting beaten up. That's the sound of a fist hitting his face. That smell is his blood, right? Hopefully your taste and touch senses don't come into play here because that would be gross or would mean you're taking part in the beating. But in addition to that, the moral sense theorists thought there's something in you that can also pick out that, like, this is wrong, right? And the moral sense theorists wanted to make moral knowledge just like scientific knowledge. They say, well, we approach it the same way. We figure out about cases that are right or cases that are wrong, cases of action. And then we take all that as data and we build from there. We get to general principles about ethics from there. And there's a couple problems with this. One, we don't seem to have such a sense, right? Like when you go through and like figure out what all the parts of our body does or do, you don't find anything like the eyes or the ears, but for morality, right? So it seems like if we can do that, there should be a part of us that does it the same way there's a part of us that does all the other senses, right? We don't smell with our knees. We don't smell with our whole body. We smell with our nose, right? We don't see with our whole body. We see with our eyes. We do touch with a lot of our body, but not all of it. We don't touch with our livers. Right? So that's one problem. Another problem is people disagree all the time about this stuff, right? You can have people who observe the very same situation and disagree wildly about what's going on in it. Now, that does actually happen to some extent in science. There's this famous case in the history of science, in the early history of embryology, where there was this dispute between two views, the developmental view and the preformationist view. The preformationist view said the way embryos develop is that for any organism for which there is an embryo, the embryo is actually a tiny version of a fully developed version of that organism. So a human embryo would have a fully developed human being, just a really small one, in it. So a human embryo has a human being with arms, legs, fingers, toes, a nose, eyelashes, eyelids, eyes. I don't know why I'm focusing on eyes so much. Hair, right? Whereas the developmental approach to embryology was like, no, embryos are just sort of goop. And then over time, they develop into the organism, right? There's a sort of order that develops out of this homogeneous, an order and a structure that develops out of this homogeneous mass. One of the earliest developmentalists was Aristotle, who did a little experiment with a chicken egg, or with a bunch of chicken eggs. He took a bunch of chicken eggs laid on the same day, and once a day he cracked them open, and then he just like put his eyes real close to it because he didn't have any magnification devices, so he just like got his eye real close to the yolk. And he just looked for a chicken, and he was like, don't see any chickens. But he said he could, over the course of 21 days, I think it was, however long it takes for a chicken egg to hatch, he could trace the development of the chick embryo. In the 1600s, Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, who was a famous Dutch scientist responsible for building, I believe, the first microscope, claimed he could see a fully formed human being inside an embryo. He said, with my microscope, I can see that there's such a thing, right? I can see a little man in there because he was a preformationist. And other people looked in the microscope, and the ones who were preformationists were like, oh, I see him too. There he is. He's looking at me. And the ones who weren't preformationists were looking in the microscope and like, what are you talking about? There's nothing there, right? It wouldn't have been happening with human embryos, by the way. It would have been happening with things. So I messed up that example a little bit. Point is, sometimes you can get cases where people who have theoretical disagreements will also tend to have disagreements about particular cases. Mill's thought is that, and that's true in the sciences, Mill's thought is that the disagreement in the moral case is more extensive. And that does seem to be true, right? Just go on Twitter to see all the different moral disagreements people have about particular cases, where you can find tens of thousands of people outraged on one side and tens of thousands of people outraged that first group of people are outraged. Now, a lot of that is being motivated by people's different political views and things like that. But Mill is just pointing out, look, this is not plausible. So the moral sense theory is out. And what Mill points out is the more sophisticated people who have that kind of view, people he calls intuitionists, they think we do have this ability to just detect moral truth, but they agree that we detect general principles. So he thinks the scientific model for moral knowledge is out, doesn't work. So we have to figure out general principles first, and then we derive particular knowledge about morality from them. And this puts the intuitionists up against, well, he thinks utilitarians, his view. And here's his critique of intuitionists, right? Intuitionists are people who say, when you consider any moral principle, like, for example, a moral principle that says children ought to obey their parents, right? There's a moral principle. It's one of the 10 Commandments. What intuitionists would say, according to Mill, is that if it's a true moral principle, and if you understand the terms in which the principle is stated, if you understand what a parent is, you understand what children are, you understand what obligation is, right? You understand what maybe respect is, if you think that what children owe their parents is respect. If you know the meaning of the terms, you'll be able to figure out whether the principle is true or false, right? Just by thinking it through. You don't need any special experience to do this. It is, as Hume says, a priori, meaning it can be known without appeal to experience. This is something similar to Plato and Aristotle's view. Both of them thought Aristotle explicitly thought intuition had a role to play in knowledge of general moral principles. Plato did never call it intuition, but Plato did think that moral truth was something that you're born knowing. You've known since birth, right? This was knowledge of the forms as described in the Republic. So Mill is criticizing these people because here's what he thinks is actually happening. Anytime someone says, just by thinking it over, I know that this moral principle is true, or I know that this moral principle is false. What Mill thinks is happening every time someone does that is all they're doing is telling you that the principles they were taught as children are right, right? When people just think it over and they don't make any reference to empirical evidence, he thinks all they end up doing is telling you that their prejudices are correct. Whatever feels comfortable to them. And what feels comfortable to you is what your society and what your culture tells you is right. And Mill wants utilitarianism, or he wants moral theory in general, to not just be a matter of people telling you that they know just by thinking it through that the moral principles their culture and their family and their religion tells them is true turn out to be true. He wants morality to be a way to criticize and reform society. The utilitarians in general were social and legal reformers. They were all involved in some kind of legal reformation. Jeremy Bentham was heavily involved in legal reforms, prison reforms, criminal justice reforms. James Mill, not as much of one. He went along with Bentham with some of the legal reforms. They all were into political reforms of granting more people the vote. John Stuart Mill was an early liberal feminist in thinking that one of the things that needed to change about society was how English society and European society in general treated women. He wanted morality to potentially show that the principles that everyone accepted were wrong. And he thought that intuition, this reliance on your ability to just detect the moral truth about general principles by thinking it through, he thought that that made morality too conservative. In addition, he thought that people who just appeal to intuition, whenever things get hard, whenever the moral situation is murky, whenever the moral situation is difficult and involves competing claims that seem good. So, for example, take that moral principle from earlier. You should obey your parents. You should respect your parents. Now take another moral principle. You shouldn't kill people. Well, what if your parents tell you to kill people? Right? Now you have a conflict between moral principles that seem on their face to be true. And the question is, well, what do we do when moral principles, both of which seem true, both of which we're prepared on their own, when we think about them, to say are true? What happens when they conflict? What Mill thinks is what generally happens here. What generally happens when you can't just say, well, whatever my parents told me was right, whatever my priest told me was right, whatever my government or my culture told me was right. Whenever you can't do that because there's some kind of contradiction, intuitionists always seem to end up endorsing the moral principle that leads to greater happiness. Or as the earlier classical utilitarians would have said, greater pleasure. Right? So remember, there's classical utilitarianism. And so he thinks really what's going on here is intuitionism is just a bunch of people saying, well, whatever my culture says is true, except for when times get tough, when they say, well, we should just try to make everybody as happy as we can. So what Mill thinks we ought to do is accept utilitarianism, which says, no, we should just make everybody as happy as we can. And if the laws our culture or rules our culture endorses lead somewhere other than making people as happy as we can, then we should abandon those rules, right? Now, he, in the process of doing this, makes a claim about Kant. So he references the Metaphysics of Morals. Metaphysics of Morals is actually a different book than the book we read. We read the groundwork to the Metaphysics of Morals. It's not actually clear to me. I don't actually know whether Mill read the groundwork, which is what we read only, or whether he also read the much larger book, the Metaphysics of Morals. Either way, he gets Kant very, very wrong. And that's something we'll return to when I'll do a series of videos at the end to compare these authors to each other on certain things. But he accuses Kant of basically being a utilitarian who doesn't want to admit it. This is the highest compliment he can give, by the way. He's right after he compliments Kant's view, he says like, oh, his book will live forever because of how, what a stupendous example of reasoning it is. He says, and even though Kant doesn't want to admit it, it leads him to utilitarianism. It does not. Kant's view is not a form of utilitarianism. Mill's not the only person to suggest this. Lots of utilitarians have tried to say that Kant is on their side. He's not, but that's for another video. So what Mill thinks is just thinking about how we know that moral claims are true pushes us towards utilitarianism. It shows that moral sense theories, where we can detect particular bits of goodness, rightness, evil, badness, wrongness, it shows us that that's implausible. It shows us that intuition, which allows us to detect which general principles are true, is really not plausible. It's just a way of making it seem better that you do whatever the conservative principles you were raised into tell you to do. And he thinks all that's left is utilitarianism. He's going to have another argument for utilitarianism later in the book, or for what he calls the principle of utility. But this is genuinely an important argument that utilitarians have always been prone to give. Utilitarians of today still give an argument somewhat like this. They give an argument that says there's really only one way to combine the idea that morality is objectively true, right? That there are moral claims that are objectively true, and where morality can potentially provide a basis for criticism of the way things currently are, and that's utilitarianism. All right, in the next video, we'll start to cover, like I said, some of the stuff that happens in Chapter 2, but it won't be restricted to only Chapter 2. This has been the video on Chapter 1, General Remarks.